This Monday in Rwanda, remembrance ceremonies for the estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus slaughtered in under 100 days. 20 years later, there's still bitter argument over the build-up, the failure to stop the slaughter, and the humanitarian disaster and cross-border proxy wars that ensued. Nerves still raw, but with Rwanda's president reiterating his accusation that former colonial powers Belgium and France were politically complicit in the killings. Paris, in turn, downsizing its delegation at the ceremony today in Kigali. We'll be talking about it, but even harder to grasp, 7 decades after the Holocaust here in Europe, is the behavior sometimes of human beings. Since 1994, from Sri Lanka to Centrafrique, there have been other mass slaughters, each with their specific scale and context. In the case of Rwanda, how could there have been this collective frenzy to wipe out the lives of men, women, and children that could be sustained over a 3-month period? It's a question we're asking today still. Today, in the France 24 debate, we're remembering the genocide. With us, he was Belgium's ambassador to Rwanda when it broke out. Thank you for being with us, Johan SWINNEN, the author of the forthcoming book, Post-Kigali, Memories of the Rwandan Tragedy. Also joining us, he was in Rwanda during the genocide, Gérard, PRUNIER, scholar, fellow at the Atlantic Council, and author of The Rwanda Crisis, History of a Genocide. It was the genocide that inspired writer Benjamin SEHENE to return to his native Kigali for the very first time in the wake of what happened in 1994. It inspired his first book, The Ethnic Trap. Thanks for being back with us here in the debate. And just back from Kigali, France 24's Catherine Norris Trent, the France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Now, for those who don't know it, we're talking about one of Africa's most densely populated countries, the land of 1,000 hills, where today, 20 years on, the killers and the victims, or the survivors, have no option but to live side by side.
This is one of 8 reconciliation villages which exist in Rwanda. A Christian NGO started building them 10 years ago to house poor families. Each one is built according to the same principle.
One house is for someone who took part in the genocide, and the next one is for a survivor, and so on.
In 1994, Lawrence lost her father, her mother, her 6 sisters, and her 3 brothers. Their killers now live in the same village as her.
Initially, when I saw the killer, I thought of my physical and psychological scars. I thought it would be impossible to forgive him. But as the days went by, and with God's help, after 2 years, I was finally able to.
For 9 years now, Lawrence's neighbour is Savio, the man who massacred several of her loved ones.
The authorities don't force us to do this. It's thanks to the love which comes after someone asks for forgiveness and another accepts. This shows we are reconciled. When she has to go somewhere, she leaves me her children, and I do the same.
Yet not far from the village in the Nyamata Memorial, not everyone is convinced by the reconciliation villages.
It doesn't really appeal to me. To put up with or to salute someone who chased me for 30 days, who killed my wife who's buried in this memorial, who killed my son, my only son. No, I'd prefer, if that person stayed in the house.
20 years after the genocide, for those who have lost everything, just living side by side with the killers is more realistic than real reconciliation.
Benjamin SEHENE, on this 20th anniversary, which is closer to the norm? Those two that you saw hugging, or that poor widower there we saw at the end of that report?
There are all types of cases in Rwanda. Unfortunately, there are instances where there is still hostility, but in general, people, try to live with each other. They have no option. And it will take time. 20 years is not enough. I don't think 20 years is enough for people to forget what happened.
Are authorities going about it the right way to help heal the scars?
Well, they are forced to go through several stages, because I don't think one can do everything within such a short, within 2 decades. There is a lot of, unless there is a generational change, I don't see how, people will be able to live.
The bad blood is still there.
There is.
You left Rwanda as a small child.
Yes.
You go back in 1994, just after the genocide.
Yes. And what I discovered is a country I had dreamed about that didn't exist. Because I had, imagined a society where there is a sort of a social peace that had existed when I was a kid. And what I found was a traumatized country, and I felt very uneasy. I didn't know my neighbors, who were also Tutsi, but from Burundi. And there was, well, it was hard getting along.
And today, is it easier?
It is much, much easier, yes, with the younger generation.
Catherine, when you were back last week, we saw on Friday the report you filmed of this couple. He, a member of those Interahamwe militias that killed Tutsis, and she, at the time, an 8-year-old Tutsi girl, and they're married together. How common is that?
This was quite a rare example. It was a very striking example. I mean, he was not in the Interahamwe, but he was armed. He wasn't just killing using a machete, which signals the fact that he wasn't one of the instigators, he said, but he was somewhere up the chain. This couple was quite a rare example, but we chose to illustrate their story because we wanted to look into how people can go about forgiving. And the wife in that situation, she said, as something Benjamin SEHENE touched on there, that she had no other option. A lot of her family had been killed. She was very poor. And she wanted to move on. What else was she going to do apart from move on? So when she met this man that she fell in love with, she decided that she was going to move forward and not forget her parents were killed. She was an orphan, many of her brothers and sisters too. But she didn't feel she had a choice but to try and move on.
Gérard PRUNIER, when you think back to 20 years ago, how's Rwanda done at healing the scars?
Well, I think the scars are the product of a historical process before the genocide. People talk of the war, the genocide, what happened after, but there was a before. It was much less bad. There was a period of whipping up, of frenzy, I would say, starting, I would say, late 91, early 92, at the time of the massacre of the Bagogwe. And then it was really like, putting a pan of milk on the fire, started to boil and you could see the level rising. In other words, the people who committed these massacres would never have killed their Tutsi neighbors 3 years before. So this is where you see the power of politics. This is why I think we're still very much struck, because this is a little bit like what happened in Germany. Most people in 1929 wouldn't have no idea of going and killing their Jewish neighbor. And by 1942, they thought it was perfectly okay. Mm-hmm. So, this is terrifying.
What happened in that period there between 1990 and 94?
But there was a military threat by the RPF, which was a Tutsi army coming from Uganda, and the core of Hutu power that was, especially Kanjogera, the lady and her brothers, they were fighting for their survival, and then everything was fair. They used the old quarrels which had, existed before. They unburied them. Now the question is, how long will they remain buried if the reconciliation does occur, or will it resurface in 2030? We've seen that with Yugoslavia. You know, we've seen a whole generation which had apparently forgotten, which suddenly remembered and started killing their neighbors. Because it's not the same as other massacres we have known, where the killing is committed by trained military or police people. There, the killing was done by ordinary people. This is what is terrifying.
Johan, SWINNEN, 1990 to 94, those are the years you were Belgian ambassador to Kigali. Did you sense what Gérard has just described, this frenzy rising?
Yeah, indeed. We have witnessed this radicalization and polarization, because Rwanda was facing two major challenges after the first attack of the RPF in 1st of October 90. Making peace, negotiating reconciliation and peace that led to the Arusha agreements 3 years later in August 93, but at the same time organized the power sharing, the military and political power sharing, and proceeding through internal institutional reforms, multipartism, respect of human rights, promotion of the state of law. And these were very difficult challenges, but there was progress. There was progress. But from time to time, and too often, I would say, there were massacres. There were the dérive, and very serious violations of human rights. What did we do? Of course, we have, I admit, we have not foreseen, we did not think that this would come to a breakout of a genocide of that scale, massacres of that scale. But I was very scared, and I repeated in many reports and many faxes and telexes, fear for what I called a tragic destabilization. Civil war, resuming hostilities, multiplication of massacres, violations of human rights. And therefore we, not only the Belgians, the international community, the European community, the like-minded countries with the Canadians, the Swiss, with the Americans, we did a lot of demarches. For instance, against the radio, Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines. This was a very, very critical sign.
This was a new private radio station that existed in Rwanda.
And that was even created before the Arusha agreements. And that became, even after the signing of the agreements, more critical and more aggressive. It was very awkward and really terrible. And angoissant. It gave us a lot of
anguish
and anger, and that's why we kept insisting more and more, working very hard diplomatically, threatening suspending international bilateral and multilateral aid. The World Bank, the IMF, all those actors were very active for warning the president, but also in Mulindi, in the Maquis, with the RPF, when we met with Major Kagame at that time, for appeasement. We pleaded for appeasement because for us the only way, there was no alternative for moderation and no alternative for the Arusha agreements either. Because we tried to convince the president and his people to be more convincing in preaching, in preconizing the Arusha agreements, the compromise, difficult compromise of the Arusha agreement. But that would lead to transitional institutions. And ultimately, after 22 months, it was foreseen in the agreements of Arusha, there would be elections. And we didn't feel a competent and a convincing commitment for explaining these accords, but at the other side...
Why wasn't there this commitment? Was it in part because the reason there were those Arusha agreements was in 1991, the rebels were stopped partly thanks to French military advisors. And did the government feel as though it perhaps didn't have to go through?
Well, there was that is a very difficult question. Answering the question to what extent the military presence of France was efficient and how far it did go in combating the RPF forces. But in '93, the French left and led the place to UN troops. But these UN troops, and we Belgians were very unhappy with the mandate. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs claimed in the early months, in the early weeks of '94, a stronger mandate, Chapter 7, peacemaking instead of peacekeeping for these troops. And this was indeed a serious handicap for preserving stability and assuring that the transitional institutions would be
And who
put into
blocked
place.
giving you Chapter 7? Who was the one who stopped you from getting it?
Security Council.
Gérard PRUNIER, when you recall the time, did you hear those voices saying, watch out, danger?
Oh, yeah. I was one of them. I remember the last time was February 1994. That was the last time I went to Kigali before the genocide. I came back and I told Mr. Bruno Delay, who was the advisor of President Mitterrand on African affairs, I didn't use the word genocide, but I said there is going to be a huge massacre soon. Mm-hmm. Soon. I knew. By February, it was sure. It was a question of time. And I thought I was exaggerating, but I wanted to shock him into some kind of reaction. I said, we will end up with 100,000 casualties. I was a little bit under the figure. But I thought I was, trying to push it, to impress him. So, no, it was obvious that it was coming. I mean, I remember in February being arrested. I was going to this bar. I was on top of the hill. I was going down to Chelando. I got arrested 7 times. I mean, 7 times in about 5 kilometers by roadblocks. And they made my driver crawl and they walked on him. The guys were at the roadblocks. It was not yet the massacre, but the spirit was there. So, the red lights were blinking.
And we know that the acrimony is still there between Rwanda and France. We'll be talking about it when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.